Hare Krishna, everyone. Welcome to this week's edition of the Hare Krishnas in Britain podcast. This is episode number 16. We've managed to persuade 16 people to come on this podcast each week to talk about different issues. This week's episode is quite different, and those of you that have seen the advertising for this will know that. What I've tried to do every week before, and we've been successful at it, is to try and persuade devotees in the UK to come and talk about their projects or their ambitions or what they're doing, what the devotees are doing in that particular town, city or village. But this is the first week where we've had guests from overseas, over the pond. You know, the Brits have got a special relationship with the Americans, and we're demonstrating that this evening with our guests from the United States. Absolutely delighted to have with us this evening Saraswati, lovely to see you. Hare Krishna.
Hare Krishna.
And great to see Dhira Govinda Prabhu. Hare Bo.
Hare Krishna.
Thank you for coming on and joining us this evening. So this week's tonight's topic is quite different from things that we've talked about before, and I thought quite a bit about whether we would do a podcast on this, and the conclusion was yes. It's really important to talk about or to raise awareness of child abuse in any organization, in any institution, and I've kind of realized over the last few months how sad it is that I guess the campaign to raise awareness of child abuse in the Hare Krishna movement isn't more known about. I mean, I've known about different things, but for me, this podcast is about bringing that discussion into the mainstream. So as a comparison, in the UK, you know, the established religions, the Catholic Church, the Church of England, if a priest or someone in a position of authority is found to be abusing a child, then it will be front page of the newspapers. It will be the main story on the news. And I think it's important that other smaller religious groups also take this particular issue seriously, and the media gives it the same attention. So I don't really mind who goes first. I guess just to start with a light introduction, who would like to tell us first kind of where they're from, how long they've been involved with the Hare Krishna movement, and kind of their story, I guess, just briefly.
Well, Dhira Govinda Prabhu is my senior, so.
Okay.
Hare Krishna. Well, thank you for inviting me, Narada Prabhu.
Sure.
And yes, well, I was first introduced to Srila Prabhupada's movement in 1980. There was a center, a Bhakti Yoga Center in State College, Pennsylvania. I was an undergrad at the time. I actually joined an ISKCON temple in Israel in 1983-84. So that's where I joined the movement, in some sort of committed way. As many chapters, I actually wrote a book about some of my book distribution adventures in the Middle East called Krishna, Israel, and the Druze, an Interreligious Odyssey. And into the 90s, I served as chairman of the board of directors of ISKCON of Alachua, starting in the mid-90s into the early 2000s. My PhD dissertation is entitled Effects of the Hare Krishna Mahamantra on Stress, Depression, and the Three Gunas. And in 1998, I accepted responsibility to establish and direct what became known as the ISKCON Central Office of Child Protection, also known as the Association for the Protection of Vaishnava Children. And really, in a direct sense, it's been 17 years since I've had any direct connection with the ISKCON organization. I host and facilitate hundreds of home programs per year, and I've developed and I conduct personal transformation, healing, leadership seminars, all based on Prabhupada's teachings. So, you know, those are a few points of my history.
Wow, thank you, Prabhu. And we'll come back to the issue of the Child Protection Office in a moment, after we've heard from Saraswati and her background, where she's from.
Sure. Well, I was born in England. So hello, all you Brits. I was born in London in 1978, and my parents said they did their happiest years of service in England. My dad renovated the Soho Temple and managed the restaurant and managed BBT and bought Croom Court for Chaitanya College. So we spent a few years there, and then I grew up in Detroit. And I've always been in the Association of Devotees, and now I'm in Hillsborough, North Carolina, where I serve on the local child protection team for my kids' school, which is Goloka Community School. And it's a really nice school, and I'm really happy with their child protection programs and policies. They train the teachers. We do background checks and CPO clearances once a year. So that's it for me.
Thank you. Just to say, I've been to what is now Croom Court a few times, and it's an amazing building, which was Chaitanya College back in the early 80s. And if you go there now, it's in kind of Worcestershire, kind of south of Birmingham, north of Bath, north of Bristol. They've kind of left one of the rooms in the building, kind of like when the devotees lived there. It's changed a little bit, but it's kind of like a museum in the sense you can go to different rooms in the house and they'll tell you different things about the history of the building. And so it's run by the National Trust, but one of the buildings has kind of been kept like a Hare Krishna temple. So the public, the great British public, can go along and find out about ISKCON that used to live there. The devotees used to live there. So yeah, it's I've been there a few times.
Nice.
It's wonderful. So Dhira Govinda Prabhu, let's talk a bit about the 1990s. You were appointed as the first ever director of the Child Protection Office in ISKCON. Tell us a bit about how that appointment came into being, why the CPO was created, and kind of what was generally going on in ISKCON at the time.
Okay. All right. Well, let's go a bit about into the 1980s. Okay. So in the 1980s, there became a growing awareness because kind of like youth who were maltreated in the ISKCON system, the ISKCON schools, they began speaking up. They as they got older into their late teens. Back into the 80s, there began to be newsletters started by some of these youth, and so there was more and more of like their voice to be heard into the 90s, very, very strongly. Fast forward a bit, 1996. Here I reside in Alachua, Florida. I've been in this area for about 20 years, and 1996. So there was like North American leadership meetings, ISKCON here in Alachua, and kind of a lot of the youth who are now young adults, they got together, and there was, like anger, like we want to be heard, like you're not understanding what happened, that sort of mood. And I mean, I lived in the area. My wife and I, we had two small children at the time, but I wasn't really involved in the scene. But I was chairman of the board of directors of ISKCON of Alachua, so I was sort of hosting the meetings. And then there was kind of like a spontaneous youth meeting, and some of the leadership was there, and it was like it was emotionally charged, I'm going to say in a healthy way. And that led to the formation of Children of Krishna, an organization called Children of Krishna. I'm not real current with things, but I'm pretty sure it doesn't exist anymore. And that was like Children of Krishna. They would raise money and give grants to youth, either for healing and therapy or for going to the university or like that. many ISKCON leaders were involved, many very enthusiastic youth were involved to support their peers. I could say names, but I don't think we're doing that here. But it was, a year or two later, I joined the board of directors of Children of Krishna, and it was a fine organization from my experience. Like, they really did a lot of good. Okay, so then early in 1997, because there was just growing energy, awareness, anger about like the history of child abuse and child neglect that was neglected, like that. Okay, there's also like the threats of the lawsuit. It ultimately unfolded into what became known as the Turley lawsuit. Okay, so early in 1997, GBC international meetings, and the GBC forms the Child Protection Task Force. Again, this is history. I wasn't on that. I wasn't like in the international scene at that time. Okay, and so the task force, they came out with a report. The report was very well done, very, 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 very well written, especially since like they didn't have like experience of a child protection officer to look out to learn from. So it was very professional and highly competent from my point of view. And okay, so then early in 1998, at the GBC international meetings, the GBC ratified the report, and the report, it gave like concepts and principles, and says, and practically sort of like in an executive sense, create an international child protection office. Okay, and so the GBC ratified it, and they funded it. At least they funded it to get started. I'll just say a name. One of the major funders. The major funder right at that time was Hare Krishna, who was Hare Krishna Swami at the time. He had his Vishvatoshini, and so he gave some substantial funding to get the international, the central office of child protection going. All right, now again, okay, so actually it was one day in early March 1998, I get a call late at night from someone named Badri Narayan Prabhu, who I know is now a Swami. And I didn't know him, he didn't know me, but he said he heard my name, because starting back in the early 90s, I was like working, I was employed with the state of Florida as a children and family counselor for the Department of Foster Care. I was involved with child protection investigations like that. And so starting in 1995, cases would come up in Alachua, reports, congregation members and who weren't so comfortable with this, or just reports of abuse. And so they were coming to me for guidance, because I was like professionally experienced and trained in this field. Okay, then in January 1998, this is just a few weeks before the international GBC meetings, a big high-profile case emerged right here in Alachua County, Florida. Basically, a main leader in ISKCON education was accused, and the accusations turned out to be true, was accused of sexually molesting boys under his care. And this was high profile. He was a main leader in ISKCON education. And so I kind of, the boys came to me. The boys came to me, and because but now they were like in their early 20s, and they came to me and reported what happened back when they were like 11, 12 years old. All right, so I felt responsible. They came to me. I'm the one they confided in. All right, so it was quite a case, and we did interviews, and ultimately the perpetrator confessed. We went to the sheriff. Anyhow, I won't get into details, but anyhow, so then a few weeks later at the international GBC meetings, they decided, yes, they want this International Child Protection Office. They have funding. Who's going to direct the office? And then there were many there from Florida, and they said, Dhira Govinda Das, he has experience in professional training. So Badri Nayan said, like, yeah, you know, would you like this? Would you like this service? So I thought about it for a few days, and then I accepted the service. And okay, there's some history. That's how it got going.
And I
Thank
think
you.
you think you were in post for 6 years,
Yeah,
1998,
yeah,
2004.
I served as the director till June of 2004.
And could you just give us maybe an example of some of the cases that you dealt with? I mean, you don't have to go into detail if you don't want to, but just some of the issues that came up during that time.
Sure. And, you know, actually, my first response to your question is not so much about cases. Like, the main way I spend my time is in the function of, like, we were a resource and guidance center. I know what's become more well known and more in the spotlight is cases and investigations, and we certainly did that. And just like, yeah, you know, sometimes like a Mataji would call and say that yeah, her neighbor who also leads kirtan of the Sunday feast, she saw him acting improperly with girls, and what should she do? You know, it wouldn't necessarily be coming, but like I and our staff, we would give guidance, or a temple president calls and says, like, well, yeah, I read a case on such and such that when he was a teenager, he acted out in a violent sexual way towards younger boys. And I know that was 15 years ago. At the same time, I just saw him in a temple in this other city in North America. What should I do? And we would, you know, we would give guidance. We also established and conducted a grant program, which ultimately we granted more than $300,000 over a few years. And it was, education, conducting child protection trainings. So, okay, yeah, and as far as the cases, yeah, probably within 2 years, we had the names of like about 300 alleged perpetrators, and maybe 30 of them are cases that more than 20% of ISKCON heard of. Most were, I guess, what we call it. So some weren't even rank and file devotees. Some might be someone who visits the Sunday feast, but was alleged to be acting improperly towards children or something like that. And so, we would investigate, and we had a system of adjudication. The framework of the system was more or less defined by the task force report, and our office, we kind of gave it hands and legs and substance. Those are some.
Okay.
Yeah.
So, I mean, so that was 17 years ago. A lot's happened in 17 years. Generally, kind of now today, how does ISKCON, with its Child Protection Office, how does it deal with, and I don't mind which of you answer this if you want a conversation, how does ISKCON today deal with child protection issues?
Well, if I could jump in, I just want to add to what Dhira Govinda said about how the Child Protection Office, not only does it handle cases, but it also does education. It raises awareness of child abuse and child protection, because doing that actually reduces child abuse in the future. So Leela Suka in Alachua, she's the North American director of the Child Protection Office. She does a lot of that. Like, she does trainings regularly for temples all over the continent. And so she doesn't do the adjudication. That's handled with the International Child Protection Office. But she does do a lot of very important work.
Okay, thank you. So in terms of ISKCON today and dealing with child protection issues today, how does it deal with it? If there was a complaint from a temple in the UK that one of its leaders had been abusing children, maybe a child, how would this Child Protection Office deal with that issue?
Um, I mean, I can respond based on my understanding. At the
Okay.
same time, I think that Saraswati might be more connected with and aware of kind of ISKCON today than me. That's why if Saraswati, if you'd like to respond.
Yeah, sure. Well, luckily I haven't had to participate in any actual cases. I mean, not luckily, like I would love to do the service, but there's so many qualified people. So it's my understanding that the situation is presented to the International Child Protection Office in England, because that's where it is right now. And then they would look at the information, gather a panel if needed, and make a decision if needed. And all this is done confidentially. So if anyone ever has a concern about like names or information being leaked or put out to the public, that's not how it is. They're very professional. Gandharvika and Kamlesh Krishna both have master's degrees in advanced child protection. They're professional and they have experience. They're super qualified.
I mean, I actually know those devotees, particularly Kamalesh, and he's certainly the right person for the job. He's very intelligent and proactive in his role. I've attended different meetings in the past, and he's been there kind of championing child protection and making sure that temples have all of their appropriate paperwork and various things kind of up to date, which is really good. So before we kind of maybe talk about what things can happen in the future or what can change, I want to touch over one particular case and one particular issue, because there's probably a number of issues we could talk about. Is this kind of current thing involving Lokanath Swami? I'd love us to kind of talk about for a bit. You know, a lot of the things that I was about to say that I've seen on social media. When you say you've seen something on social media, it doesn't mean it's necessarily true. But so I became aware of it via social media first, and then via other sources off social media. These various things were verified through, for example, an email conversation I had with the current GBC for the UK, who I know relatively well. So in terms of a particular case surrounding Lokanath Swami, I just wondered if Saraswati, you want to maybe just briefly talk about that and the
Sure.
kind of the historical issue and kind of what's currently happening now in ISKCON relating to this particular case.
It seems that in 1990, Lokanath Swami stayed in a family's house and he sexually abused an 11-year-old girl. And she came forward 3 years later, and the GBC tried to do an investigation to the best of their ability. There was no child protection office then. That was set up in 1998. And over the years, since 1993, the GBC have placed restrictions on Lokanath Swami, lifted restrictions, placed restrictions again, but never has the Child Protection Office actually handled this case. So recently on May 12th, the GBC Executive Committee said that they were suspending Lokanath Swami's GBC and group status until the Child Protection Office has a chance to properly review the case, which they never really did. But then a few days after they said that, they took the case away. So right now, a lot of people are asking the GBC, will you please let the Child Protection Office handle this case and handle it without interference from the GBC?
Can I just ask to add some bit of detail into this? I believe, I might be wrong, but I believe that back in the 90s, Lokanath Swami did admit to this. Did that happen?
Yeah, there's a few semi-public letters that he gave to his disciples. There's a couple apology letters to the family, and there's a ton of correspondence with his disciples privately, where they talk about it also.
Yeah, I mean, that was the thing I mean, a lot of it stood out for me, but this particularly stood out for me that Lokanath Maharaj actually admitted to this in writing as well. So it's on paper, you know, or in email. And it's kind of come up 31 years later uh, for a number of reasons. Tell us, I mean, from what I understand from conversations I've had with devotees off social media, is that Lokanath Maharaj was stripped of his kind of right to initiate and freedom to travel, which nobody's traveling anyway at the moment, you know, and his various ministries. I think the thing that concerned me was that then, I wouldn't say it's kept behind closed doors, but then there's no public notice or announcement. And I think there has to be some better way of announcing things or making people aware. So somebody high in ISKCON in the UK told me that one of the requests to Lokanath Maharaj years ago was that going forward, he should always tell new disciples of his about the 1990 case. And I know a handful of his disciples in the UK, and I have to admit, I haven't asked them or spoke to them, but I'm going to make an assumption, which I haven't actually verified. I'm going to make an assumption that he probably hasn't told them, because you can't check. No one's checking on this.
Well, some disciples were told and some weren't. And then some were told with a disclaimer that it was a lie. It's all lies, but they had to tell them. So there's been a lot of misinformation, which is part of this complicated story. Like, disciples are finding out later that their beloved guru did this thing and it's breaking their hearts. What to speak of the victim and her family.
I spoke to a devotee in the UK recently who very strangely tried to justify the whole thing to me by saying, well, you know, the girl at the time was 11 and Lokanath Maharaj thought she was 18 and he made a mistake. Well, firstly, most 11-year-old girls don't look 18. And secondly, whether she's 11 or 18, a sannyasi shouldn't be touching a woman. That's actually...
Any man, like sannyasi or not, he shouldn't be touching a female without her consent.
Yeah. You know, and this devotee explained it to me as a moment of madness, which I was upset and angry about, that we're even trying to defend this issue.
Yeah, I mean, even the GBC's report on this was whitewashed. They downplayed the details a lot, to the point that when people read it, they were like, oh, that's not a big deal. And even over the years, when there were whispers about it to me, no one knew the details. I didn't know the details. And even the GBC members, some of them today, apparently didn't know the details.
So what's the situation now? So it was handed to the Child Protection Office to deal with, and then the GBC took it back. Why did they take the case back?
Good question. I think they were under pressure from some parts of leadership in ISKCON.
Okay.
There's nothing public. They did this all in secret behind closed doors. So
this is a slight, usually I allow the guest to talk a lot. I'll just say one thing a little bit more. I'm kind of the view that using this as an example, the Lokanath Swami case, we're in a different era now to when we were in the 80s or the 90s. Now social media exists. Now, because of social media, because of the way the world is, everyone has a voice. And a number of devotees, you know, back in the 90s, you know, people could exchange private letters and things could be done behind closed doors. But these days, it's very difficult to keep things hidden. So even if, you know, for some bizarre reason, Lokanath Swami is allowed to go back to the status or the role that he had before, it's all kind of out now in terms of social media, in terms of devotees having their own views and their own opinions. So it's very difficult to kind of, you know, push things into the past, which I think ultimately will make things very difficult. And child abuse cases in the past kind of can be kept in the past, unfortunately, because we didn't know about them. Social media wasn't around at the time. You know, I couldn't Zoom with you two in the United States at a click of a button. It's very different these days. It's very difficult to keep things kind of hidden. So what kind of improvements do we want to see, would you like to see in ISKCON in relation to child abuse issues today? How could ISKCON be better at dealing with child abuse issues?
They can improve the Child Protection Office through funding, so they can have more staff to personally check on situations, investigations, and temples. Like just recently, a couple months ago, there's a Gurukula in Russia where the headmaster was just found to have molested a bunch of boys there. So if the Child Protection Office had the resources, they could have gone and checked personally and see like what was actually happening and talk to people in person and gauge what was actually happening. So that could help, like funding for staff, and also letting them do their job without interfering. I saw an interview with Dhira Govinda Prabhu where he talked about towards the end of his 6-year term as the director, getting a lot of interference from people not involved in the cases, trying to add their opinion and sway him in different ways. Maybe if you could say something about that, Dhira Govinda Prabhu.
Okay. All right. Well, I appreciate your response, Saraswati, that, yeah, you gave that example recently in Russia. And so yeah, my experience too is the Child Protection Office, the international director, and here in North America, Lasuka, we have sincere, competent people. And so I would imagine that funding could help prevent something like what happened in Russia, or prevent, or at least raise awareness of it a lot sooner, like that. So education, funding, yeah, and well, okay, so even, okay, well, the Lokanath Swami case is an example where, yeah, there's like involvement that's not directly about child protection or principle or truth. There's other stuff going on. And I'll say that actually, when I was serving as director of the Child Protection Office, if members of leadership, like, or members of ISKCON, if they wanted to share with me their view, I was fine with that. I was fine with that. If it was in a straightforward way, An example I'll give, a high profile case at the time was the case of Danudar Swami. It was a high profile case back in '98, and maybe still to some extent. Anyhow, and so we had a panel, and it was like kind of an expanded panel because it was very high profile. And I would be contacted a few times by, I'll say the name, Jayaveta Swami. And Jayaveta Swami would share with me that, like, and he was fine to go on record, anything he wrote, anything he said, that, like, I think that you and your panel, you should consider this point, and you should consider this point, and like that. And someone else might come and say, well, I think that this testimony from this youth who was there, I want to add to that because I was in Vrindavan at the time. So, you know, like in any sort of adjudicatory process, we take, you know, let's hear character references for this one, for that one. I was fine with that. It's upfront and clean. Not just I was fine, like it felt in integrity. Anyone's entitled to their opinion. What felt unhealthy, toxic, was like all sorts of manipulative shadow stuff. Well, like has gone on in the Lokanath Swami situation, and I'm not pointing my finger at Lokanath Swami. I mean, of course I am for what he did, but the organizational leadership has consistently, even from before I took the Child Protection Office leadership, they've consistently been like deceptive, cover up, conceal, lie about the concealment. That's the sort of thing where it's just like, that was that sort of culture, felt very rotten. And apparently, at least to some extent, it's still alive today organizationally. So that would be like, or we would go through the process and we would consider everything and we'd come out with an official decision. But then because maybe the one who was, found guilty of the transgressions, but maybe he was a close friend of this leader or that leader, or maybe he himself was in a leadership position. So then the restrictions and the guidelines and the requirements for sincere apology or financial restitution, they would be ignored, or not always, but especially in some high profile cases, if you have friends in the right places, they'd be ignored. And maybe members of the panel, their name would be smeared and slandered to try to do politics to, so that sort of thing. As far as, any member of ISKCON or the society leadership, they want to straightforwardly share their opinion, I'll consider it straightforward, clean. But the, just like dark, corrupt, behind the back, manipulative, shadowy stuff. And again, I'm not involved today really in the organization, but I'm a little bit on social media, not much. And Saraswati shared, like, when I think you asked her, Narada, like, well, how come the GBC reversed their decision? And she said, good question. So maybe there's a very clean, wonderful reason, full of principle and integrity. But, based on my experience, I kind of suspect not.
Okay. I was just looking down at my phone to try and get some stats, because my next question is kind of in relation to, is the Child Protection Office, the International Child Protection Office, is it adequately funded today to do the work, to manage ISKCON's issues all around the world? Is it adequately funded?
Well, the funding has decreased over the years. I think it started with $150,000 in 1998, and now they get $10,000 a year.
Mm.
That is a significant decrease.
$10,000.
And that's how the GBC can control whether they want to protect children or not. If it's important to them, they will give funding for it. But if they, if they're not in the hot seat, then maybe it's not a high priority for them and they're not going to give funding for it.
So the $10,000, it's an international pot of money that the GBC funds it, and then yatras and countries fund the GBC, and it's a whole kind of pyramid type funding thing. I mean, in terms of ISKCON in the UK, I know how it works is that there's 12 ISKCON temples. They all give a proportion of funding to the national office, and that funds staff and that funds various things. And there's bigger temples and there's smaller temples. Bhaktivedanta Manor is the biggest temple, and there's some smaller temples. And so in the UK, we have the Charity Commission, which means that if you're a registered charity, all of your finances are public. So there's no secrets. And I was just reminding myself, ISKCON UK is on the Charity Commission website. And overall last year, it spent £2 million on staff. So I don't know what that is in US dollars, £2 million sterling on staff in the UK alone. And it's so sad, therefore, that the world is only spending $10,000 on child protection. I mean, most of those staff are at Bhaktivedanta Manor. I have discussed with various people how those stats are broken down. Most of them are at Bhaktivedanta Manor, but nevertheless,
I'll just interject.
Yeah.
When I was aware that I was completely unaware of the numbers. I mean, I was through 2004, I was very aware. But when Saraswati said 10,000, I was actually shocked. I was like, that's appalling. That's an appallingly low number.
It is. Absolutely.
Well, that's not even a full-time wage for anybody. I mean, whichever
No.
country you're in, really.
They have to work full-time jobs. And then how much time do they have left to look at cases? These cases are piling up, and it's not their fault. They're doing the very best they can, but they don't have the funding they need. Devotees can donate also. I can list the 2 websites in the comments when we're done.
Yeah, and when this podcast is broadcast, I'd love to put any links you want me to put. I mean, to anything within reason, particularly funding the, £10,000 is an embarrassment, actually.
She said $10,000, which is even less.
Yeah, sorry.
£10,000.
It's about £9,000, maybe. It's a bit, which is nothing, which is actually illegal in the UK to pay someone that much money to do a full-time job. Okay. In terms of going forward for the future, how can we make child protection in ISKCON, or dealing with child protection, more transparent?
Well, I was talking to a few devotees about this, and they had some really great ideas. One was having a board of directors that I don't know how they would initially arrive, like the choices of the members, but they could be voted in. And this would help reduce interference from the GBC, who would have a conflict of interest if another GBC member was being investigated. And someone had this great idea, which I really love and I want to share, to have a year of child's protection, just like there's the centennial year for Srila Prabhupada. Have a year of child protection, which potentially could be, I think 2020, it would be in the next couple years. It would mark the 25th anniversary of the Child Protection Office. I think 2023.
My maths are terrible. 2023. Yeah.
2023, correct. That would be 25 years, 2023, correct.
Yeah, so there could be a whole campaign where the temple presidents would present at the Sunday feast. This is the Child Protection Office. This is what they do. Let's have trainings. Let's protect our children. This is what you can do as parents. And funding could be raised for the Child Protection Office, awareness, education, and all this would reduce child abuse and prevent it to great numbers, I think.
I think that's a fantastic idea. A whole year raising awareness of, child abuse and dealing with child abuse and child protection. How do we protect children? I think there has to be a greater understanding amongst the devotee community that there is a child protection office, and each temple should have an assigned child protection officer, at least.
Well, how it's set up right now is each temple should have a child protection team made up of at least 2 members, ideally more, and they should meet at least once a month. And through this child protection team, they would do background checks and child protection office clearances, which means that a new devotee comes to move in the temple. They submit this name to the child protection office and just get a clearance like, hey, is this devotee okay? And there's also annual trainings that Leela Sukha does for all the temples. And in the last year, she's been doing it online. I've taken 2 of them with her and they're excellent, really informative. And I feel empowered after the 6-hour training.
That's really good. It's really encouraging. I mean, I think there has to be much greater awareness. Dhira Govinda Prabhu, do you want to say something?
Yeah, my understanding is what Saraswati described about each temple is child protection team meet once. My understanding is that's already ISKCON policy. That's already ISKCON policy, and has been for a while. And so that's good, in my opinion. But then, yes, as far as like monitoring accountability system, that's missing. And because, again, there's a Continental International Child Protection Office. And again, if there was funding, then competent, trained Child Protection Office, they could be checking in, supportive. I don't like the words much, but enforcing, like, connecting with the temple board, the temple president. Well, it's been 2 years, and is there a child protection team, supporting? But it seems that there's not enough financial support or even energetic support in an organizational sense to monitor and implement what's already good policy. And then, so, like, I appreciate this, what's it called? Podcast narrative. I appreciate this. You're raising awareness. And where you started, I don't know if it was the pre-session or right at the start of the session, like your understanding, what your understanding is, like, okay, we talked about this high profile case, and kind of like in the UK, your impression is like no one knows anything pretty much, or what, maybe whatever anyone knows is 90% misinformation. So that's a problem. That's a problem. And it's not a problem that happens by accident. There's like a culture perpetuating ignorance, in an organizational way. And then shows like this raise awareness and shine light on truth. So this is the solution. It's part of it.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, it's really important that we're kind of raising awareness of what's going on. I know one of the questions, Saraswati, I think we might have touched on it a bit, was that we kind of shared via email, if that makes sense, was what can parents do today to better protect their children?
Well, I actually got inspiration from Dhira Govinda Prabhu in his interview with Damodar on Vedic Inquirer. He shared that parents can help protect their children by being present, being observant, and not leaving it to the GBC or the temple presidents or anyone else to make sure that their children's welfare is sufficient, but that the parents have an active role in their children's lives. So I think that's really good.
And I read something recently, and my perception, if that makes sense, of how ISKCON operates them in the UK. So there's some bigger temples, there's some smaller temples. So the bigger temples, Bhaktivedanta Manor is the obvious one. You can go when there's no pandemic, you can go for a Sunday program, and there's thousands of people. So some parents might say, well, my kids want to go and play, and it's very difficult to kind of keep an eye on them because they're with their friends, And what's happening at big temples like the Manor is that you've got the residents that live there, and you've got the kind of regular visitors, but then you've got thousands of other people just popping in, maybe from the Indian community, because it's kind of a tourist destination place. There's the George Harrison Memorial Garden, there's the link to the George Harrison built the building. So lots of visitors just visit. And often there's thousands of people there, so that's kind of my experience of Hare Krishna temples in the UK, that some parents might say that it's very difficult to kind of keep an eye on my child or something. I'm not defending, I'm not saying they, that they, whatever, but they might say it's very difficult to keep an eye on their child at places like this, and they don't know who's there, or, that type of thing.
Yeah, it is hard watching your children, especially when they're young and they have energy and they want to run around. But something that parents can do is take turns watching the children. And this is what some temples do, like at a Sunday program. They'll have like a sign-up sheet, and each parent does like a half hour or 1 hour. And there's verbal confirmation, okay, I'm watching the children now. And then they pass it on to another parent. Or if the kids want to play together and one parent wants to go somewhere else, then they're like, hey, can you watch the kids while I go over here?
I think, kind of thinking now, the reason why I gave that example was I read in a paper recently about some of the terrible abuse that was happening at kind of Gurukul boarding schools back in the 80s. And to think that, I mean, are there still Gurukul boarding schools, or are they only in India, or are they elsewhere as well?
Yeah, a lot of the serious abuse happened in the 70s and 80s in ISKCON. Tragic, horrific, devastating abuse that never should have happened. But now we can acknowledge those survivors, because some of them are they're suffering so much trauma that just the mere mention of the word Krishna can trigger them. And we shouldn't blame them for wanting nothing to do with ISKCON. They've suffered so much, some of these people, the students. So as a result, there's not really a lot of boarding schools because they were not run properly. Although Dhira Govinda said there was this one Dr. Sharma in Vrindavan Gurukula that Prabhupada had put in charge, and he wasn't even like
He wasn't a disciple of Prabhupada. My sense, maybe even he was a Mayavadi or like that. Well, this is, well, it's an important, relevant point if we want to go there. And so, yeah, just so that your viewers and listeners are clear, yeah, this wasn't light stuff, or it wasn't like, there was some pretty bad stuff. No, this was like horrendous nightmare stuff happening year after year. Like if you would take the case file of what happened in Mayapur from late 70s through 91, and like take the case file to like just the basic child protective investigator in New York City or London, they would say, well, this is a ring of violent pedophile criminals, obviously, like that. Not, also like it happened 2 or 3 times. No, dozens and dozens of times. Anyhow, just so your viewers are clear, and I mean, I just mentioned Mayapur as an example. But Mayapur, from my investment, it was probably the most egregious of the severe child maltreatment. So it wasn't light stuff, and it wasn't. Boys play. It wasn't like that. It was like violent stuff with adults involved, or at least adults at best negligent in their supervision. That's a very generous interpretation. Yeah, and so yeah, I just want, I think it's important that you know that they're clear on the history.
One of the kind of things I share with devotees sometimes, or one of the concerns that I have about ISKCON, is that the world or society will often criticize religious groups like the Mormons or the Jehovah's Witnesses because they deal with these issues behind closed doors. They kind of deal with them within their own ranks, and it's all kept hush hush, And unfortunately, on quite a few occasions, it might have been that some parts of ISKCON might have done the same, as unfortunately a lot of religious organizations do. They'll deal with things kind of behind closed doors. Is there any policy in ISKCON? Is there any practice in ISKCON just to phone the police, or as well as to phone the police and make the police aware now of something that's going terribly wrong?
Yeah, it's in the Child Protection Office guidelines. The most up-to-date guidelines is from a couple years ago, and there's about a page and a half of what to do and how to do to report to secular authorities, police, child protective services, like in your city or county. For United States,
yeah.
Every country has their secular authorities.
Yeah, we would always recommend, advise, know to whoever called, with congregation member, temple president, GBC, know your local laws regarding child maltreatment and reporting child, know your local laws and follow them. At the same time, sometimes when I visit social media or my attention is brought there, sometimes I see something simplistic like, yeah, just report to the police. That takes care of everything. Actually, there's no need for a child protection officer and all this investigations and justice. So that's kind of simplistic thinking. Yeah, we don't want to be like, we hide things from law enforcement and social services. Yeah, we want to report, and as Saraswati emphasized. But for example, okay, let's say even if it's a situation where the police got involved and even the perpetrator ends up spending time in prison. Okay, so then let's say when he comes out of prison, now, okay, so now the police or social service as agency, they're not concerned whether this convict who's now out of prison is leading a Bhagavatam class or conducting initiations or leading a kirtan. But organizationally, probably the organization wants to be concerned, and so therefore something internal is important. That's just one reason. There are other reasons too. Also, I'll give one. Like I remember a case. This goes back to '98, and it was sort of local. Anyhow, so yeah, it was like a high-profile devotee, well-known in the organization, and so he had several. It was clear several child sexual abuse victims, and it came out years later. So one of the victims is a young adult, and I personally go to the sheriff's office with the victim, and the sheriff said, "Okay, well, all right." So I was chairman of the board of directors of ISKCON of Alachua. I mean, I had different capacities, but I couldn't do anything. He said, either one or more of the alleged victims needs to file charges, or their parents, because they were minors, so their parents can also file. In that particular situation, none of the alleged victims or the parents chose to file charges because the abuse happened in other states and they would need to spend money and time to go to other states, and they just decided we're not going to do it. So I'm just saying there are nuances that something like, just call the police, that takes care of everything. Yeah, let's report, true, and it doesn't take care of everything in most situations. And I just want to, I mean, my experience is the culture of concealment and cover-up in organizationally, back in the years I was involved, it was more the rule rather than the exception. Not just the years I was directly involved. Okay, I left the service of director of the Child Protection Office in June 2004. Still, many devotees, even till today, they write to me, they call me on the phone. This is happening. Can you do something? And I'll share with them, I'll empathize with them. I'll say, I have no position right now, but I can refer you to Leela Sukha or Kamlesh or something like that. But so this was in 2009, 2010. And I get a few reports. And again, I'm 5 years away from having any official service, 5, 6 years. I get a few reports about stuff happening in Mayapur, okay? And so then I write some letters because I was concerned, because I believe between 98 and 2004, we actually made substantial progress to clean up Mayapur, not just abuse, but like just in the whole sort of consciousness and culture around how they regard children and teenagers, okay? And then from the reports I was getting, like things were slipping down the slippery slope into a dark pit. That was the impression I was getting. So I wrote to, it was the new international director of Child Protection Office. This is not Kamlesh. This is like 11 years ago. Okay. And so I said, I'm getting these reports, and I'm really concerned. And I wrote, especially considering the history of child abuse in Mayapur, in ISKCON Mayapur. So her response was, what history of abuse in Mayapur? Now, I wish I was making this up and then I would go, I'm just joking. No, I'm not joking. I'm not joking. This is enraging. Like she got the training. I had someone, a devotee here in Alachua, because I wrote an article about this called A Festival of Red Flags. And he said, at that time, that was the time of the huge BP oil spill in the Gulf of Mexico. He came to me at a Sunday feast and he said, it would be like if the new CEO of BP Oil was asked about, cleaning up the oil spill. And he said, what oil spill? Like that. So again, there was just like generations and generations of violent rape in this place. And her response was, what history of abuse? So I said, what history of abuse? I mean, have you, I don't think I contain myself very well. So what do you mean, what history of abuse? Okay, and then she wrote back and she quoted, because like Saraswati mentioned, every temple should have a CPT, a child protection team. So Mayapur had a child protection team at that time, and I'm slight paraphrasing, but the essence is there. So the director of the child protection team told the director, the international director, that back in the 80s till 91, that was a few boys playing. There's a few boys playing. So that's the thing. So even if you have policy, but if the director of the child protection team, I mean, I don't know, I think you get my point by this time. So that was 40 years ago. No, that was 2010. Things are all cleaned up now. Personally, I doubt it.
Yeah, so that's what's happening today. Well, recently, 11 years ago.
The title of this podcast is child abuse in ISKCON. We all have a responsibility to speak out. Child abuse is something that everyone should be concerned about, and I'm very keen from this podcast and through people raising awareness of it that everyone is concerned about children's safety. Just because we are following Srila Prabhupada and ISKCON is Srila Prabhupada's organization, it doesn't mean things are perfect. It doesn't mean that everyone's getting along and everyone's being nice to each other and everyone's a pure devotee and everyone's a sincere Vaishnav. We're still living in this material world where bad things happen, even in organizations like ISKCON. And it's important that people are aware of some of these issues that have gone on. I really enjoyed some of the things you've talked about. I particularly like the ideas that I think we've kind of brought out.
Could I mention something real quick?
Yeah, sure. Go ahead.
I just wanted to go back to Dr. Sharma. And the reason I mentioned him was because he wasn't like one of the Hare Krishna devotees, but he was qualified. And that's why Srila Prabhupada put him in charge of the Gurukula, because he was very loving, according to the students. And then I think he was removed. Soon.
Yeah, that's the story I got. I'll go back to that. And so my understanding, and it's a little bit there in the conversation. So Srila Prabhupada put in charge of the Vrindavan Gurukul someone who wasn't even his disciple. What I've heard is he wasn't even like a bhakti yogi, but he was like an elderly Indian educated gentleman with a lot of experience in education. I'll tell a story that's in some of my writings, about the Child Protection Office. So one of the in 98, I conducted an interview with a young adult. He was maybe in his late 20s at the time, and he tells the story. He tells the story that when he was about 8 or 9 years old, his mother sent him to the Vrindavan Gurukul, and he was in like Chicago. They were in America, and so this was around 77 or so, 77, and so he said he was in Vrindavan, 9 years old. He felt homesick. He naturally felt homesick. And he said at the same time, his Vrindavan Gurukul experience was very sweet. He said the headmaster was Dr. Sharma, And he said that sometimes Dr. Sharma would slap the boys, and the boys all knew if Dr. Sharma slapped us, we deserved it. Like, it was like, that was the culture. It wasn't so much like Western culture with no corporal punishment. We deserved, they felt his love. So then this boy described, because I'm interviewing him, he's in his late 20s, and he described then, well, Prabhupada passed away November 14th, 1977. And he said, well, a few weeks later, and now his memory may have been a little fuzzy, maybe it was a year later, but anyhow, he said he's remembering his memory from when he was about 9 years old. So then there was the first GBC meetings without Prabhupada. And then after the meetings, the way he described it, then this new regime came. And the way he described it, like violently, at least emotionally violently, if not physically violently, they got rid of Sharma and his whole team. And they put in a new regime of their men. And he said, very poignantly, said, from that day, my childhood became a nightmare. And then they just had all these, many immature, sadistic people supervised by, anyhow, maybe some other people with other agendas. And he said, from that day, my childhood became a nightmare. And that's, well, sorry, yeah, you've emphasized that, Saraswati. For me, it's a very deep point that Prabhupada wasn't looking like, like, is he following all the rules? This is like, here's a mature gentleman with a lot of wisdom. And then that was lacking. And then the sexual abuse, the physical abuse, then just the insane, perverted, demented craziness. I mean, I wish, yeah.
Who was the headmaster after Dr. Sharma?
My understanding is that Danadar Swami became minister, or became headmaster.
I just wanted to say something about something that happened recently.
Sure, go ahead.
Last year, there was some kind of like petition by some GBC members to have Danadar Swami reinstated as a guru within ISKCON. So some background, he left ISKCON on his own in 2006 because he wanted to keep his disciples and his guru status. So he's like, well, I'm just going to leave ISKCON. And then I guess some of his friends wanted him to come back. There was a group of devotees that led a campaign because a lot of people were not happy with this. So they were like, we don't want Danadar Swami coming back. He did a lot of abuse. And during this like campaign to block him from coming back as a guru in ISKCON, Guru Prasad Swami said to all his disciples, he said, leave Danadar Swami alone. He's a good man. All these Guru Coolies that are saying bad things about him, they have all lied. These are lies. I know him personally. And what he did was he's causing trauma to the victims all over again by discounting what they experienced and not acknowledging like what happened to them. So
that's very painful. It's very painful for me to hear, Saraswati, and you're speaking truth. It's very painful. Very painful.
Yeah, so if any gurus are watching, some advice, don't do that. And support the children who have survived abuse in ISKCON because this is your movement, and take care of the children. They're special.
Thank you. I think that's really important. And just kind of reiterating what I said earlier about things are different now from 30 years ago is that things can't be kept secrets anymore. They can't be kept quiet because social media, because we can talk, because we can communicate. You can't hush something up anymore. you know, once things are online, they're online forever. I mean, you know, and it's good that I think it's really good that we're having this conversation. I was a bit, I guess, nervous today, kind of before this podcast, because most of my podcasts are quite lighthearted. They're a bit humorous. We talk about different issues that are quite comical to some extent, to show that the Hare Krishnas are real people in the real world. But this was a very different type of theme. But what I've particularly liked, and I've jotted down some of the things we've talked about, was what can change, what can improve, what do we want to see, and some of the things I've jotted down. We would love to see, Saraswati mentioned, was a year of child protection, raising awareness to child protection, maybe 2023. I've written that down. More funding is desperately needed. $10,000 a year, not pounds, is an embarrassment, you know, to an organization that wants the world to take it seriously. To be spending only $10,000 a year is a huge embarrassment. Where this is public information on the Charity Commission website, ISKCON in the UK spends £2 million on staff. So it's an embarrassment. Number three, I think we kind of touched on this, and I think this is important, that every devotee, and we all have a responsibility, every devotee should make themselves aware of who their child protection officer is in their temple, or who their child protection team is. So I use the manor as an example. I haven't been much of the last year because of the pandemic. I actually live quite far away from the manor, but there is a notice board with the pictures of the child protection officers. And you walk past that notice board whenever you leave the temple. And I'm hoping the other 11 ISKCON temples in the UK have a similar thing. If not, they need to get that poster up, on the main exit and entrance points. And the other thing you touched on, Saraswati, was some kind of board of directors. Was that like an international board?
Well, I looked at this list a couple of weeks ago. I can't remember everything. There was like 8 points or something. But it was basically to keep the Child Protection Office independent of the GBC without interference, and also supported by funding. So there's all these different things that could be implemented, and I can share that in the comments later on.
That'd be good. I mean, I don't know how, because things work very differently in the United States from the UK in terms of the state and how the state manages things. I think in the UK, there's probably, as an example, the public are much more okay with the state running services in the UK. We like the NHS. We like the government doing things. I mean, some people are more conservative, some are more liberal, but it's okay for the state to do things. But we also recognize there are some arms of the state that are funded by the state, but they're independent. Like the police has to be independent from the government because nobody's above the law. The police, the Charity Commission, the different watchdogs that manage what's on the television, or, politicians' codes and what they should and shouldn't be doing. So I understand as a Brit how very easily how an independent child protection office should work, but can still be funded by the organization it's scrutinizing. I understand that very clearly how it should work. So anything else that you want to say before we kind of close this podcast today?
I just want to say thank you to Dhira Govinda Prabhu for joining us, because he has paved the way for child protection and has probably done more than any other devotee, in my estimation, for child protection in ISKCON. So a big thank you.
Hare Krishna. I appreciate the opportunity to be interviewed and respond to the questions. And thank you both for inviting me to this opportunity.
So Hare Krishna, thank you. Big thank you to our guests, Saraswati and Dhira Govinda, for joining us on episode 16 of the Hare Krishnas in Britain. If you're watching this on Facebook, please do Like it. I don't think there's a dislike button yet, which is good. So please do like it. Please do share it. It's really important that you share it and put some positive and proactive comments below in terms of how we can improve child protection in ISKCON. And also, if you're watching this on YouTube, please do subscribe to this channel. And again, share the link and don't be afraid to kind of get in touch. I know that after the podcast we did last week on LGBT issues, a lot of devotees got in touch privately with our guests to share their stories, which was fantastic. So if there's anyone also that, you know, wants to share something after watching this, please do. I know I have the contact details for various people in the child protection team here in the UK. So thank you all for tuning in, and we'll see you on next week's edition. Hare Krishna.
Thank you, Narada.
Hare
Hare
Bo,
Krishna.
Hare Bo.
Hare Krishna.